From all the video we introduce how to declare a two-dimensional array, how to find the sum for each row of the two-dimensional array. You also can pass the two-dimensional array through the function. So now let's combine everything we learned to see if you can solve this problem. So I want to show you here is I have 3 students. And each student, they have 5 tests. So I have 5 test scores for them to record. So that's a good example how we use the two-dimensional array. So then here you will see I can have a two-dimensional array called scores. So then how many rows I have is according to how many students. So in each row, how many columns we have is according to how many tests we have. So we initialize the score array like this. Like we say, each inner braces mean the number of each row. So then you can see this inner braces will be the grades for the first student. Then the second braces will be the second student. So then you see the last one will be for the third student. So if I give you an array like this, can you find the total and average for each student? Can you do that? So this one actually is just like earlier we told you. I want to find each student, right? So that's why you see I need to find the total grade for the first row, the total grade for the second row, the total grade for the third row. So then I can find the total grade for each student. So after you know the total grade for the student, can you find their average? Right, of course you can, right? After you have the total, you just need to divide by how many tests. So that's 5. We can get the average. So now before I show you the answer or the source code, can you think about how you will write the function, how you write the nested for loop for that? So if you can, I want you to pause the video to see if you can write in the pen and paper to have the idea how you will find the total and average for each student before you see my solution in the next page. So that's pause the video. So I hope you finish to try. So let's see how we will get each student's total and average grade. So just like earlier we said, we have the total for each student is for each row. So every time we try to access the data from the two-dimensional array, we need to have nested for loop. So you can see here is outer loop. Here is our inner loop. So since we want to find the total for the row, so that's why your outer loop will be the row. Row start from 0, the row number less than how many students. So then since we want to find the total for each student, actually here the total will be for the iteration for the inner loop. So we can either declare here or you can just have that to assign to 0. So now after you have the total equal to 0, that start our inner loop. So your inner loop will be the column start from 0. So how many tests for each student? You see, then you just add the value for each cell to the total. So this one actually is the inner loop. So let me put the underline. Here is the inner loop. So after you finish the inner loop, you have the total for each row, right? So that's why here actually is out of the inner loop, but still inside each outer loop. So then you can get your total. And using the total divide by number of the score to get the average. So then here we just display average and the total for the average for each student. So that's the result for each student. So let's check our sample code in our example 16. So the beginning, we already declared the number of students and number of score. Then we already declared the total and the average equal to is the double data type. So actually for our score, right? So here actually we show you the example is, earlier we only have our 2D array data type is int. But of course you can be double. So that's we have the double data type. So then here is earlier we show you each the nested for loop to calculate each student's average score. So that's why your total initialized before your inner loop. After the inner loop, you find the average, then we display. So then we can run the program. So the first part actually is for the student output. So from here, that's only see the student part. So you can see your first nested loop have each student's average grade. Of course, here, if we want to show them the total grade, you can add as well. So now this one is for the each student average, right? So continue. The same thing, I want you to use this two-dimensional array. You see, they are still the same two-dimensional array. But now I want to know for each grade, for each test, what is the average for the student's grade? So that's why you see here, I put a box here. You have one, the first column actually is for all the grades for the quiz 1. Then you have second column, that's for the second test. Then this one for the third test. So the next one for the fourth test and the fifth test. So now if I want you to calculate the total and the average grade for each test, how should we do that? Yeah, so this one will be a little different, right? So earlier when I show you all the total for the column is complicated. But if we just separate it to think about I want the total for each column, how should we do? So this one actually, if we only want to know the total column, so we can do is, let's still have a nested for loop. But one thing here is, you see, because our purpose is to find the total for each column, right? So that's why here, our outer loop condition actually is for the column. For the column equal to 0, column less than the number of the test, so then we increment. So that means in each outer loop iteration, we are calculating the test based on the test. So the total is still equal to 0, but our inner loop is, I have the column fixed in the second dimension. Then our inner loop is the row. Because for example, you see here is the first test. The column is 0, but the row numbers start from 0, 1, and 2. So when we want to find the total or average for the column, we just need to make our outer loop become the condition boundaries column. Then the inner loop is the row. So the row starts from 0, row less than how many students. So when you add the total, be careful because column always is the second dimension. Row is the first dimension. So even the inner loop, outer loop condition changed, but row and column, they cannot change their position. So then in the inner loop, I can find the total for each test. Of course, afterward, you can have the average for each test, but the total should divide by how many students. Then I have the class average for different tests for their average. So that's how we will display the average for each test. So the same thing, if this one we write on our program. So back to our example 16. So then the second part, that's the class average for each score. Like earlier we say, you see the score actually is the column. So that's why our outer loop should be the column. Then our inner loop is the row. So the total after we get to add by each element, will be the total for each test. So then we can divide by how many students to get average grade. So this one actually we don't have the separate function to write. So we have everything in the main function. If you want, of course, you can have those things in the function. So then you can make sure how you pass your two-dimensional array. So then here, let's run the program. Then we will see the output for all of them. So you can see from the first inner loop, first nested for loop, we are trying to get here. Yeah, so that's the first for loop. So our outer bound is row, inner bound is column. So that's why we get the student average. But then actually, if I want to get the test average, so I have the other nested for loop. The outer bound is column, the inner bound is the row. So that's why we can get all the average for different tests, their grades. So if you want, of course, you can add the total. So then we can see much easier. So you see score average for students, or you can add so that's the score for the student total we add. So then we can add the class total for different tests. So then after we add the total, then display the average. So you can see if you run the program, you are not only see the average, you also have total. So that's for the student. So you can see here, everything they have the decimal points. That's because we set precision equal to 2. And we do show point. So that's why if they don't have the 0 you want to display, what we can do is we just for the 2 0 actually because we force that to have the set precision equal to 2.